In this lesson, we'll learn how to remove the background from our stock image, as well as discuss both destructive and non-destructive workflows for this project. Alright, before we get started, I'd just like to let you know that Digital-Tutors would like to say thank you to iStock Photo and the artist Iconogenic for their image that was used in this series of lessons. You can access this same image and thousands of others by accessing your exclusive Digital-Tutors iStock discount at the following site. Alright, so I have the project file 02_begin open in front of me here. Now, as with any photo manipulation project, whether it be a small project or a very complex project, ultimately you have a goal in mind, your creative vision for where you want to take this project. Let me go ahead and start off by sharing with you sort of my creative vision for this particular project. So what I'd like to do is take this photograph of this model and I'd like to transform it into sort of an android version of the ideal female. Now, ultimately, the word ideal is up to your own interpretation, but as this course progresses, you'll see my interpretation kind of unfold in front of us here. So, the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do to start this off is I want to go ahead and duplicate my background layer here. And what I've already done is I've already began taking steps towards a non-destructive workflow. I'm preserving this original background layer. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the little padlock by double clicking on it, and we'll just hide that here. I'll even name that one Original Photo. And now let's go ahead and focus up here on the background copy, because this is what we're going to start working with. Now, if you were taught in a similar fashion to me, you probably didn't know how to use masks when you first started using Photoshop. And you might have come in here and tried to erase away this background. If that thought even crossed your mind, let's rewind and get rid of that thought completely, because we're going to use a mask here to get started. I'm going to go ahead and hit W or Shift W if you need to go ahead and grab my quick selection tool. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag a quick selection right down the model here, and we'll fill in the right side here. And once Photoshop finishes making that selection, we'll go ahead and drag in another selection over here on the left side. And you can see here, because of this neutral background, we're working with a pretty good photograph for knocking out the background pretty quickly. Now, as Photoshop finishes making that selection, I may come in here and go ahead and hold Shift and just add in this area right here. And we'll go ahead and complete that selection just like so. Now, if we look at these marching ants, or this selection here, we can see here that Photoshop's done a pretty good job, especially around a lot of these crisp edges here, around her legs and her arms and things like that. But around her hair, not so much. It hasn't done a great job of selecting this area. We've got several strands of hair that are outside the selection. But because of the new edge refinement tools in Photoshop, we can actually clean this up with our masks. So let me go ahead and create the mask. I'm going to alt-click the new mask button here, and we're going to drop on a layer mask here. Now, with this layer mask in place, we all know that we have just hidden those pixels. They're all still there. Now, in many of my courses, I've emphasized use masks, don't delete pixels. But this course is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be making some extensive changes to this image, and it's going to come to a point where it's just going to be easier to commit to the mask, because I'm going to need the transparent pixels, and we're going to end up merging layers together. So there comes a point in some of the more complex projects, like this one is going to get, where the mask ends up getting flattened into the project. So, but you know what, we can always recreate that because we still have the original photo here. So right now, let's go ahead and zoom in here, and let's go ahead and refine this mask. I'm going to come over and select my mask, right click on it and choose Refine Mask. And you can see immediately it drops a black background in behind our image. That's because the view is set to do that. And you can see because of that, we've got a lot of the background that's still showing through our model's hair here. So you can see exactly how dirty that mask really is. Kind of a good mask down here around her legs and her shoes, because you can see that edge is pretty crisp, but these softer edges are giving the mask problems. So let's go ahead and turn on our smart radius here under edge detection, and I'm going to slowly bump up the radius here for the mask. Now, if you've used this tool before, you should be familiar that the radius is a radius around the edge where we're trying to refine the mask. Now, you can always come up here and click this Show Radius button. You can see a visual representation of that radius here. Smart Radius is just going to let Photoshop use its own algorithm to determine the difference between a soft and a sharp edge around the mask. So I'm going to come in here and let's bump this up to around 9 or 10 pixels or so, and we'll work with it from there. We'll just manually type in a 10 pixel value there. Alright, so that's done pretty good, but we still have a lot of areas here that really are pretty dirty. And I'm going to come over here and switch over to my overlay mode, and yeah, you can still see there is some hair outside of our mask that we want to include. Now, I don't know if we're going to end up keeping this hair, but I want to make sure that it is included in the mask if Photoshop has the ability to do that here. So part of the mask refinement process is using both the Refine Radius tool and the Erase Refinements tool if you need it. And those are located right here. Obviously, we can just mouse over the area outside this dialog, and by default we have the Refine Radius tool active. You can see there's buttons up here in the control panel for those two tools as well as a size slider. So I'm going to come in here and let me just go ahead and zoom in, especially around her hair here, and I'm just going to use this Refine Radius tool, and we're just going to kind of brush into some of these areas where the mask is still kind of giving us some of that background color bleeding through the hair. And let me undo that. And let me go ahead and hold down the Alt key, and I'll use that Erase Refinements tool to bring back that change here. And I tell you what, I'm actually going to bump that radius down just a little bit. And as soon as this dialog finishes working down here, we'll come back in and brush in this mask. So this is part of the mask refinement process. You've probably done this before, and you really know how important this is to getting a nice clean mask, especially around complex objects like the human form in this case. So we'll just come in here, and I'll come in and mask off a few of these areas here, kind of clean up some of these areas in this mask, but I'm not going to do all of them. I'm going to end up doing a lot of this stuff between lessons. Now, one of the things I like to do is, as I'm making these modifications to my mask, is I like to come in here and I'll change the view several times during this process. I'll look at it on a white background, I'll look at it on a black background, I'll even look at it on that Rubylith red preview there that we just had it on. And I tell you what, let's come over here and just kind of paint in some of these hair strands that are missing here. See if we can't refine that area of the mask. You can see that brought that back pretty well. And we'll just kind of paint in up there. You can see we're doing a pretty good job of bringing back some of these hairs that we're missing here. So again, we may not end up even keeping these hairs, but if at all possible, I definitely want them included in this mask. And we'll just kind of paint down the rest of her profile here, including any hairs that we come across that are outside of this mask. Alright, so that did a pretty good job on that side. Let's come up here and we'll just kind of paint down this side as well. So masking is really sort of a core element in Photoshop. And if you've done photo manipulation projects before, you probably understand how important it is, because you're starting with pixels on your screen and you're changing those pixels in some form or some fashion. Now, depending on the extent of those pixels being changed, is obviously going to affect exactly, you know, how many of those pixels that you actually want to keep in your mask. Say, for example, that, you know, this female android, I didn't intend for her to have any hair at all. Well, there's really no point in us spending time collecting all the hair here inside the mask if we're just going to end up painting over it or getting rid of that hair. Alright, I tell you what, let's go ahead and let me just zoom out here, and I'm going to kind of glance really quickly at the rest of this mask, making sure that it all looks pretty clean, and it does look pretty clean. So let me come down here and kind of look. Let me come in here. I think there's a shadow under that foot. I want to kind of pick up on a little bit of that. There we go. We can get some of that in there. And let me go ahead and look at one last element here. Now, one thing that I'm really conscious of, especially if I'm going to end up keeping this hair, is color contamination from the background. And you can see here that there is just a little bit of that around the edges of her hair here. If we're worried about that on our project, this refine mask dialog actually has a really good tool for fixing color contamination. You can see a little bit of the blue and purple tints around the edges of her hair. We can come in and select that little checkbox right there, and you can see by default it removes 50% of what it sees to be color contamination here. So there we go, turn it off for you, and we'll turn that back on. And you can see how that purple tint seems to disappear here. Now, in doing this, it's not going to allow us to make a destructive change to the layer that we're working on, because what this is actually doing is changing the colors of the pixels. So the output option, if we look at that, there's a couple of them grayed out. We can't output it to selection. We can't output it to the layer mask. We're going to have to output it to a new layer, or a new layer with layer masks. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it on that option right now, and let's hit OK. And you can see we have yet another copy of our image here, now with our mask on it. Now, I'm pretty happy with this mask, and I know I have the original photo layer down here, so I'm just going to delete the original copy. And we're going to go ahead and stick with this particular copy. Again, I can always recreate that mask if I need to, because I have the original photo layer hidden here. Now, that brings up a good point. Non-destructive versus destructive workflows. Now, as a Photoshop artist, you don't always have to use non-destructive workflows. They're highly recommended, and you're probably never going to back yourself into a corner using a non-destructive workflow, but you don't always have to use them. You can mix and match your workflows. This mask is a non-destructive workflow. Instead of erasing that background, we've masked it out. But as I mentioned earlier, we're going to get to a point in this course where I'm going to flatten that mask down. I'm going to commit to that mask, and we're not going to be able to undo that, because we're going to be painting on top of that and doing a variety of other changes to this image. But we still have this layer right here. We can always come back in and remake that mask if we ever need it again, and we can remake it in just a matter of minutes. So in my opinion, non-destructive workflows doesn't just mean masking. It also takes the form of backing up layers, like I've done here. I've created a copy of that layer. And what I'll also do when I'm working on a photo manipulation project is I'll save iterations of the file. I'll work on a file for a certain amount of time, and then I'll save a new copy of it. And as I look back through my files for a certain project, I'll find a beginning file. I'll find, depending on how long I've been working on it, I'll find sometimes up to 5 or 6 different copies of that project file that I've been working on. All that is, in my opinion, considered a non-destructive workflow, because I can follow the breadcrumbs back through my process of creating the image back to a point where I can find a certain layer or a certain mask, whatever it is I'm looking for. So with that said, my point in saying that really is this. Be creative in how you use or how you work with a non-destructive workflow. Be creative. Back up your layers. It may make your file large, yes, but hard drive space is cheap. Photoshop does quite well with files of 100, 200 megabytes. I say if your computer can handle it, then go for it. Back up as many layers as you feel you need. Alright, so with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson. We're going to continue on working on this photo manipulation project, and the next step in the process is going to be removing and replacing some of the unwanted details here in the original photo.